Order. Welcome to this session of the Justice Committee and our evidence session in relation to our inquiry on the Coroner Service. Welcome to Mr. Freer and Mr. Davis. I'll ask you to just introduce your roles in a moment. We have to do our declarations of interest. I'm a non-practising barrister, former consultant to a law firm.
I'm a barrister with a current practising certificate but not undertaking any direct court work. I'm a former Solicitor General, former Chair of CAFCAS, former Chair of the National Child Safeguarding Practice Review Panel. My brother is Chair of the Prison Reform Trust, and I'm currently giving informal advice to ministers on family justice policy.
Right. Nothing else from anybody. Okay. Well, Mr. Freer, thank you for coming. I know you're the Under Secretary of State at the department and you have responsibility for the policy issues here. And Mr. Davis, your role?
I'm the Deputy Director for Deaf Management, Miscarriages of Justice Compensation, Inquiries and Coroner Policy.
Well, thanks very much for coming to give us. Mr. Freer is a regular, so nice to see you again, Minister. Can I just start going back a little bit in time, perhaps, Minister, back to when the Lord Chancellor was doing your job in 2021, when we did our earlier report. And he gave evidence to us that the Coroner's Service in England and Wales was, quotes, operating really positively, end quotes. Earlier this year we had the Chief Coroner give evidence to us, Judge Teague, and he said, well, the service is, quotes, chronically under-resourced and underfunded, end quotes, to the extent he said that the rule of law was under threat. So rather different analysis from two perspectives there. What's your analysis now you're in the post?
I have to say, Chair, that's a rather surprised comment, because the conversations I've had with Chief Coroner, those were not the contents of our conversations. It's certainly true that the Coroner Service is dealing with increased demand, and certainly the amount of time that it takes to get through the process is not as fast as we would like, for a variety of reasons, which I'm more than happy to touch on. But in terms of, I thought the Chief Coroner would probably have said more resources would have been always welcome. I've never yet a public servant who wouldn't always welcome more resources. But broadly speaking, I think that the Coroner Service is working well. There are things we need to do to, I think, to deal with demand into the system and also to streamline some of the issues. And I'm more than happy to touch on things like the number of post-mortems being requested, the number of pathologists that are, or lack of pathologists that are causing the problem to slow down. But broadly speaking, I wouldn't characterise the service the way that the Chief Coroner has, but perhaps he's closer to it than I am.
Perhaps in fairness, I'll give you the full quote that he gave us in January. In my view, the Coroner's Service in England and Wales is, with very few exceptions, chronically under-resourced and underfunded. There comes a point at which underfunding imperils the rule of law. That is not an exaggerated statement. So, a judge in whatever jurisdiction has to know that he or she can decide the case on the merits of the case, on the justice of it. If, as a result of chronic underfunding, you get to a situation where a coroner's decisions are partly dictated by economic necessity, judicial independence no longer exists, and that imperils the rule of law. That, I'm afraid to say, is a point we have already reached in some areas. That's a very grave assessment from the Chief Coroner. That must worry you, surely.
Well, certainly where I would agree with him, certainly because of what's known as a triangle of responsibility, the funding mechanism, as you know, is a little bit complex. And certainly in London we have some, shall we say, strains in recruitment through the Met. And I'm certainly not in a happy place with the way the Met are approaching their responsibilities to the coronial service in London. But more broadly speaking, whilst I accept that we've got problems on recruitment in some areas on the investigation, particularly in London, we do have problems with pathology. We do have problems with the volume of PMs, which I think there's a big debate to be had as whether the changes on things like the changes to the MCCD, the medical cause of death certificate, but also the way we handle what's called the 28-day rule will also then reduce the flow of demand into the system. So I wouldn't characterise it the way the Chief Coroner has, but I would accept there are strains in parts of the system.
As you said, the Chief Coroner is perhaps closer to the ground than any minister with the best will in the world can be. I'll kind of come to the triangle of responsibility in a minute, but you made the point about post-mortem delays. Now, we've also made the point of visiting coroners in our own areas to get a sense of the feeling. And we've found, I think all of us have given evidence, quite starkly in some cases, where the delays to the post-mortems are so bad that actually you can't get a meaningful assessment of the cause of death, frankly because of the state of the bodies when they've been waiting for so long to be dealt with. That can't be right, can it? That's got to be an urgent matter to deal with. Something where the bodies have decayed to such an extent you can't anymore find out the cause of death, which is the whole purpose of the coroner's inquest.
Well, in terms of, I have to say that I've not had a direct conversation from the Chief Coroner where he has expressed it as forcefully as that. Certainly the coroner's areas I've visited, the biggest impact certainly in Westminster was a lack of investigators, which was slowing things down, and that goes back to the point I touched about resources in London. But in terms of, I think it was down in Exeter I visited, and again the issue down there was a shortage of pathology, and most acute in paediatric pathology. So I accept that those are areas that are causing strain. But direct conversations on that the Chief Coroner hasn't raised directly with me, and I get on well with the Chief Coroner. He hasn't expressed it in quite so forceful terms, which I will happily go back and find out exactly what his concerns are.
Well, I think that would be sensible, and I'm very happy to send to your officials the full transcript of his evidence, which was very detailed.
Maybe that Mr. Davis
Mr. Davis, have you had any discussions to that effect? Yeah.
We are obviously aware of the challenges facing coroners in terms of getting pathology provision and sort of the impact of obviously delays, which is kind of why we've obviously had a cross-ministerial group and an official level steering group, which is kind of looking at putting in place an action plan which has been agreed. One of the things that we're obviously taking forward, and we've had a call for evidence on, is the level of pathology fees. As part of the action plan, we're also looking at kind of training provision in terms of increasing the numbers of pathologists, and also having engagement with the HSC on to what extent it might be helpful to bring pathology, coronial pathology, into the NHS contract. So that's work that is being taken forward because these are sort of complex issues, and as you rightly say, they are creating challenges in certain geographical areas.
Has the Chief Coroner been involved in the development of the action plan?
I believe he's been cited on that, yes.
Has he been involved in its development? That's different to being cited. Has he had a say and a hand in steering the action plan?
I'd have to double check. So unless someone
pretty basic point, if I might say.
Understood. Certainly, I always take the view that our teams
He
work.
has.
So one would hope, it might be worth perhaps to have a further
certainly, I know our teams work very closely together.
The other situation that was raised was this. You talked about the triangle of responsibility, Minister, and there is a particular problem in London. I understand actually the Metropolitan Police have carried out an internal review, but are so far refusing to disclose the contents of that review. Have you had any luck in getting access to it?
Have they not given evidence to you yet?
No, they haven't.
Okay.
I intend to write to them, as I find that a wholly unsatisfactory situation and unacceptable behaviour on the Metropolitan Police's part.
Well, I would share your anger that if any part of the public service doesn't cooperate with the Select Committee, I would take a very dim view as you do. And certainly, I know the Chief Coroner and I wrote to the Commissioner asking for a meeting to discuss the particular issues in London. That meeting was downgraded to an Assistant Commissioner. And the Chief Coroner gave very firm views to the Assistant Commissioner that he thought that was disrespectful, and I share that view. For a senior member of the judiciary asked to see the Commissioner in London, that meeting should be granted, especially on such an important topic. People forget, I think, that the coroners are judicial office holders, and the Chief Coroner is a senior member of the judiciary in this country and should be dealt with accordingly. The internal report from the Met, sadly, the only thing I can really share is that they are as yet unwilling to meet their responsibility to staff the London region. In my view, I think that is a great shame, put it as gently as that, because all we're asking for is, in terms of the vacancies, is about 1% of the police staff in London. That's not warranted officers. There's 10,000 police staff in London. and the vacancy is 1% of their establishment, and that's all we're asking for to ensure that the Coroner Service in London is met. And it is disappointing that so far they are not willing to do so. So what I'm going to do, I'm now liaising with the Chief Coroner as to how we can escalate that lack of support from the Met, because I do think it is causing us problems in London.
Yes, that certainly is something that I think the committee would agree with, and I must say I share your concern at the discourtesy shown, frankly, by the Commissioner, it seems, personally. And I hope that there'll be some explanation forthcoming to you and to the Chief Coroner as to why that behaviour took place, which is surprising, if I may say.
Indeed.
But can I just drill down to one other point there? One of the suggestions, of course, is that it is this three-way involvement that causes the problem. And one suggestion that was made is, you could have a national service. There's a difference of view perhaps between us and government on that. But somewhere part way will be the idea of taking the police out of the equation and transferring the responsibility for the coroner officers, etc., to the local authorities. Mm-hmm. Is that something that's going to be examined as perhaps future
Well, it's
plans?
certainly something that, certainly in London, one of the options that I have thought about is if the Metropolitan Police are unable to fulfil their statutory obligations to the service, is whether it should... I'm not suggesting it should be disaggregated down to the 32 London boroughs in the city. No. I think that fragmentation would not be helpful. But there's no reason why perhaps it couldn't be transferred to City Hall. Because, of course, the Police and Crime Commissioner for London is the Mayor. Yeah. And there's no reason why we couldn't suggest it be transferred to City Hall. That might provide a bit more focus, and it might provide that level of direct access that perhaps the Chief Coroner needs, particularly on the London. Across the rest of the country, I think that if it were to be entirely in the remit of local authorities, we would have to ensure that the money followed it, because there's no point in transferring the responsibility unless the budgets follow.
Yeah, there might have to be some transitional funding, for example. Or something
indeed.
Like that.
And it's certainly worth looking at.
Yeah.
My personal view on a national service is I'm not convinced. I think if it evolves over time, as we get through more and more area mergers, as we've seen several this year, if it is more organic, then that's fine. But I would be a bit wary of, if you like, adding on a national layer of bureaucracy onto the Coroner Service. Not least because, A, there's an additional cost. I'm not quite sure where I'd find the money. But equally, if I can speak with my local knowledge, particularly where you have very large faith communities, the ability in my patch and in other parts of London for a coroner to be able to respond quickly to religious needs. So as you know, some religions require a very rapid turnaround on the coroner decision, but also there is quite a large pushback on invasive PMs. And so that level of nuance, that level of local knowledge, I think could be lost with a national service. So that's why I'm a little sceptical whether a national coronial service would be appropriate.
There is, of course, the point in London. I think one of the London coroners has been a matter of some controversy under our current localised system about the approach of one of the London coroners towards faith-sensitive deaths and post-mortems.
I mean, of course, I'd be careful not to strain judicial independence, but the Chief Coroner has been exemplary in ensuring that all his coroners are fully aware of the religious sensitivities and to take them into account as they should.
So the issue perhaps being this, that under our current setup there is a variation which goes beyond the purely local circumstances, it might be suggested.
Given coronial independence or judicial independence, having a national system wouldn't change that. You'd still have the ability of the post holder to have that fierce independence, whether you have local management or national management. The purpose of having local management is it allows your local leadership to exert some influence on how the service is run locally to meet those local needs. That's the coronial independence as judicial office holder is fundamental. And so I don't think a national body would make that better, but I do think having that local knowledge and that, if you like, that local nagging of electoral representatives to be able to have that nuanced is an important benefit of having a local service.
There is a national court service that hasn't impinged upon the independence of the judiciary.
It's a matter of a debate as to whether that's improved the service.
And what about the levels of variation in the amount of time it takes to have inquests heard. That varies greatly, doesn't it, between various parts of the country? Isn't that the matter of concern?
So I think if you look at a national service, that there are always, I'm not always sure a national service gives us the if you like, the powers to change, the powers to manage that perhaps we think it does. Particularly, as you know, as you mentioned, the court service, we have variances in how the courts operate, despite having a national HMCTS, because of the way judges operate their courts fiercely independently. So having a national body doesn't always deliver a national equal service.
Mr. Timpson, want to come in?
Yes, just pick on that just very quickly. If the government's current view is move towards a sort of more regional, national scale coronial service should happen sort of by evolution rather than being done directly from the centre. One of the advantages, when I went to go to see the Warrington Coroner's office, one of the advantages of being able to scale up the resource for a local area is that often they may be in a situation where, for instance, in Warrington, they've got new courts opening, but they won't always have enough coroners to hear the cases, but they're then not able to draw in coroners from other areas because they are providing service in Manchester or wherever else it may be. Isn't there a case, first of all, through the mergers, of widening the ability to use the resource of coroners more smartly so that we don't get delays, but also look at potentially having a national pool of coroners who can help where there are issues of capacity, cognizant of the fact that local knowledge is still important?
Of course, the business case that underpins any merger that is approved will include that level of flexibility of resource. Does it bring economies of scale? Does it bring flexibility? Does it put the service closer to the user group, etc., etc.? Not all of them are approved. Sometimes you find either the business case doesn't stack up or local opposition to the merger from elected members is such that it doesn't proceed. But the ability to have a kind of a pool, I think, is worthwhile investigating with the chief in terms of seeing whether that is an ability. Of course, as we know from the court system, it is not always easy to get judicial office holders to move around the country.
Annie?
Minister, you mentioned about the faith-related deaths, and I think the reality is somewhat different to what you as a minister has been told and what actually is happening in reality in terms of the release of bodies for faith-related deaths. 19 days or plus is not uncommon. In Birmingham, I'm mentioning that. Where does the accountability sit? Because the judicial officer is used as a barrier to stop the coroner being approached. Right and proper once the investigation is happening, but once that investigation has happened, a body's been released, but then you don't get an annual report from your local coroner, and you don't get how long it has taken to release. How's the chief coroner going to know, and how are you going to find out?
So the chief
because what mechanism have we got as elected members if families come to us after the event, and this is by no means trying to interfere in the process, where it has taken 19 days for a body to be released, and it could perhaps have been released maybe in day 2 or 3.
Okay, I accept that it will always be difficult where none of us will know the circumstances in the local area at that local time. The Chief Coroner has expended a considerable amount of time issuing guidance and best practice to his coroners, so that they should, wherever they possibly can, expedite the process where there is a faith requirement. That doesn't mean that everyone, I mean, I have them in my own patch, I have a very religious constituency, and I know it doesn't always happen, but the Chief Coroner has made it very clear within his bounds of his role that local coroners should use their discretion to make the process as fast as possible, because they are aware. But it won't be everyone. There may be other factors as to why a particular case is going slow. The option, of course, is you can always write to me, and within the bounds we can make this, within the bounds of our constitutional requirements, we can inquire as to what the problem is. And there may be problems that we're not aware of. But at least if we can find out what has caused the delay, at least allow the families some understanding, even if they're not happy about it.
And would you expect the family members who are waiting for the body to be released on faith-based reasons to inquire with the coroner's staff, and after a week to be told, we can't tell you anything, and then they call back 3 days later and saying, you're being awkward now, we can't tell you nothing, you just got to wait? Is that good enough?
That's not the kind of if you like, the service I would expect. I mean, the whole process.
That is the level of service that is being provided.
We'll take that away to
the bereaved families in the Birmingham and Solihull Coronial area.
We have done quite a bit of work at trying to improve the way the bereaved are informed of how the coronial process happens. Historically, it has been done to them rather than having them alongside. It is an official and quite a formal process, but that doesn't mean it needs to be officious. And we've done quite some work on trying to ensure that coroners try and ensure the families are informed as what's going on, even if they don't like the process, but they should at least understand it. So I will take that away to the Chief Coroner and try and find out why your constituents are not getting the right level of service.
If you want the details, and it's more than one case, I'm happy to share them to
Please
you.
do.
Family members are happy to write to you, so you can fully ask the questions equipped with the facts.
Good.
Thanks, Mr. Adby.
The other thing, if I could, I'm more than happy. I have met the various faith burial groups,
yes.
And I do meet them to ensure that their concerns are met. In fact, only just yesterday I visited the Gardens of Peace in East London to understand the challenges facing the Islamic community. And so there's a regular dialogue, and so I'm very happy to take cases up if you write to me.
I'm very grateful to that, Minister. I think that's much appreciated by us all. I'm grateful to you. The final thing, from my point of view, is this. In reality, what happens, certainly in London and probably most other places, there's a lead local authority for the coronial area. Quite a number of local authorities, you can think of perfectly on the public record, Croydon, for example, which is the lead authority in South London, have issued Section 114 notices. Birmingham, I think, has been not an easy position either. What steps do you, perhaps you, Minister, or Mr. Davies can help us, what steps do you take to ensure that the lead authorities are actually financially viable and are in a position to meet their statutory obligations? Because the concern must be...
Interesting question.
Serving Section 114's, what can you do to ensure that they're able to do it?
Interesting. I have to say, I hadn't given that a lot of thought. It was a very fair challenge. I'm not sure whether Mr. Davies has an answer, or it's something we'll have to look at.
Take away.
Yeah.
Would you like to take that away and perhaps
it's a very fair
come back
challenge.
to us? Yeah.
Yeah.
We're both local government people. We know the consequences of this.
Indeed.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. Ms. Hopkins.
Thank you. So it appears the Coroner Service has not recovered from the pandemic as well as hoped. There are still serious delays in some areas, and the Chief Coroner told us they're due to get worse. So what, in your view, are the main causes of these ongoing delays?
Well, if I can answer that in reverse, and what we're looking to try and do to take out some of the volume. It sounds a bit clinical, I apologise, but part of the problem, as we've discussed, is the lack of pathologists, and so that's why we are currently consulting on the fee. And that isn't just general pathology, but especially acute in paediatric pathology. So we're consulting on increasing the fee. We're also consulting with colleagues at Health, because it perhaps has slipped down the training rota for junior doctors, so that they need to learn pathology. I apologise if I've got the wrong terminology, but broadly speaking, trainee doctors used to have like a stint, and that has kind of fallen away. So we're talking to health colleagues about getting that back up onto the teaching agenda. In addition, something called this, I think it's the Section 28. I've just to check which act it is. I think it is Section 28. Section 28 of the... This is where the medical certificates. So if you died, you haven't seen your doctor within 28 days, 28-day rule, not Section 28, apologies, the 28-day rule, it automatically gets referred to the coroner. So with the new the medical certificate of cause of death, and then that should then go to the medical examiner, what that should do, the medical examiner may find some cases that should go to the coroner that wouldn't have done, but it's most likely to find those cases that would have automatically gone to the coroner because of the 28-day rule no longer need to go to the coroner. So we're hoping that should see a reduction in the volume. So the medical examiner, the new the MCCD and which will impact on 28-day rule not being applied, and pathology should mean that the volume of PMs post-mortems going into the system should reduce. It is an interesting challenge. I haven't got the data to hand, but certainly we have more post-mortems per head of population in the UK than any other European country. And that's an interesting fact to have a look at as to why. It may be because of our systems are very different, and so we generate more. But it's certainly what we are seeing is more people going into the system that perhaps shouldn't go into the coronial system. And those measures we're taking should see the volume drop.
Just to push that, the main causes of the ongoing delays, notwithstanding some of your reply saying here are some answers to try and reduce it, is simply we're having more post-mortems per head. Is there any other reasons for the delays?
More people are dying. Certainly we're finding the death rate has not dropped post-COVID. More broadly speaking, I mean, in terms of across, if you actually look at the statistics, the actual death rate across the UK has not declined post-COVID. It has remained high. And just a pure factor of statistics, it will inevitably generate more people going into the post-mortem system. But there's no specific reason that I'm aware of. It's just pure volume and then slowing down by those other factors that I've mentioned.
There was £6.15 billion given to local government to help with the pandemic recovery, but it hasn't really resolved the backlog of inquests that built up over the pandemic. Is there going to be any further funding to help Coroner Service in particular?
Well, and certainly I'm not aware of any additional funding in the same quantum as the 6.15 billion. I think what we have to do is understand what is, if you like, what is now the steady state in the coronial system and ensure that that is correctly funded rather than just throw a large amount of money into, post-COVID recovery. I think what we really need to understand is what is the new norm, and then see what needs to be funded rather than just saying we need another 6 billion, because I'm not sure that is especially helpful.
So that links into the next sort of question, in that when the Chief Coroner spoke with us, he provided us with some quite striking evidence of where and how his office had helped targeted a coroner area and to help reduce its backlog, because the areas that were targeted saw a net overall reduction of nearly 18% in old cases, as opposed to elsewhere where they weren't targeted, a net overall reduction of only 2.5% everywhere else. Is this the sort of thing, or have you considered providing the Chief Coroner with, say, more staff to do some of this surge targeting to help reduce the backlog? So particularly while the current delays are sort of brought down and under more control.
The operational side of the service is entirely down to the Chief Coroner. I mean, our role is policy, but if the Chief, and obviously providing funding, but if the Chief Coroner has a business case as to how the backlog can be brought down quickly, then we'll always look at it.
So if he was to...
I can't say I'd be able to get the checkbook out, but I can always... That
was obviously going to be my next question. If there's evidence-based, to show that with this additional resource we could actually reduce the delays we're seeing in some of these.
If we have a strong business case, there's always then a business case to go to Treasury with.
Yeah, and
that doesn't necessarily mean that it would be looked on kindly.
Even though we all want to hope that families of the bereaved are at the heart of this process.
I agree.
Does it simply come down to money?
I agree. Well, all systems come down to money. All systems come down to money. We can't operate any system without money. And so in terms of finding if there is a proper business case that we can show will transform the service, then I'm always happy to go into bat with the Treasury to see what I can do to secure more money.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's a question of priorities. I think the families ought to be quite a priority.
Yeah. But as you know, across HMCTS, lots of parts of the system are under strain. Yeah.
Indeed. What a question. Dr. Mullen.
Thank you. I just wanted to pick up on the questions from Ms Hopkins, and you mentioned yourself about death rates, etc. One of the things we asked the charities last week when we spoke to them about this issue is whether MOJ kind of models population change and what you might expect is, at certain times, increased mortality rates, more people dying as an ageing population comes to its end of its ageing period. And do you do that? Does anyone essentially look at capacity and modelling and what we might need in the future? Is that an MOJ responsibility?
Mr. Davis is?
That's not something that we do within my policy area, but I think it's right that we kind of link in terms of understanding death management capacity across government to understand sort of trends and demands and what might be happening and where future pressures might be coming from. So I think we are having those conversations with colleagues, but it's certainly more that we can do to make sure that we are ahead of the curve in terms of understanding what those trends might look like.
And then on a simpler level, when it comes to individual coroners and their local population, are you able to point to higher or lower ratio coroners that would be more or less, have a higher rate of cases they have to look at for their resources, essentially? Does anyone do that?
That's not something that we routinely do, but obviously we can kind of pick up with the Chief Coroner and his office to sort of see what we can do to understand sort of local trends in that regard.
Okay, thank you. And just to pick up then on some of the things we've talked about already around pathologists specifically and the cross-government action plan, which I think was published that last year, 2023. Is that right? Do you know what month that was published?
I don't off the top of my head. I think it was last summer, but I can clarify that.
Just whether you wanted to, you touched on it to some extent, Minister, but whether you wanted to add any particular progress that you've made on any of the 5 domains of that action plan.
Do you want me to say that one?
Yep.
Yeah, so I think the main one that we've been progressing, and obviously this links to a recommendation of this committee a couple of years ago, was in relation to pathology fees, and we recognise obviously this is a complex issue. There isn't one particular solution that will resolve this issue generally, but the thing that is obviously within our gift as the MOJ was to look at the level of fees, and we undertook a call for evidence in December to look at and ask a range of questions in relation to levels of fees, issues that were happening at a local level, and we had a number of responses to that call for evidence. At the current time, we are assessing those before we provide advice to ministers, and then potentially with a view to having a consultation in due course where we can set out what our recommendations are for fees. In addition to that, obviously there are sort of medium-term and longer-term discussions that we're having with colleagues, Home Office and DHSC, around, and Minister Freer alluded to, the kind of training and what additional training can be provided, how we can incentivise that, what the implications of that might be for other areas, and obviously we've got to be conscious of that and mindful of it, but also around both sort of training and the sort of structural arrangements, so whether that should be part of the formal NHS contract as part of the call for evidence. I think there were mixed views on that, so obviously we need to give careful consideration to those, but that gives you an indication of the types of work that we're looking to try and progress as quickly as we can. Okay.
Do you think, if you just look at the fee issue specifically, that something that I think it's 2021 that we said it needs to be looked at, you agreed that it should be looked at in summer 2023 and we're not even at a consultation yet. Would you describe that as swift action?
No, I think obviously there are a number of competing priorities. As I say, I think this one was initially one of those ones that was rejected, but I think on reflection we recognise that actually there's an important role here in fees, and that it's right that we sort of take it forward and we look at that. And so we are mindful obviously of the funding implications of it, and that's something that we continue to engage with DLUC and others on, but obviously we're keen to try and progress that as quickly as we can now.
If I just ask you on the swiftness, obviously it's the death management team, which is a lovely term, is a small team in the MOJ. Okay. And it has quite a lot of cross MOJ work to do. But when certainly it became very acute in my visit to Exeter about the problem with pathology, and it was following that visit that we then set up the interministerial working group and spoke to the policing minister about the forensic side, spoke to the then hospitals minister who was responsible. It was then Will Quince now, Andy Stevenson, about the role of pathologist in NHS training. And so when it became very acute, certainly to my point of view, then if you like, we did put a lot more oomph behind getting this job underway.
And you touched on the fee implications and talking to DLUC. So would I be correct in saying that actually it's not a Home Office budget issue? That would be a fee that you set that then local government then is obliged to pay. And is the what's the ministerial understanding between departments that they've got to consent to that? Would it be a kind of joint agreement with DLUC where they have to agree to it, or could the Home Office say actually we have to put the fee up? It's just not reasonable.
I don't think we can impose it.
Yeah, we'd have to, there is all sorts of new burden implications that we need to take into account.
And has there been any discussions with Treasury about, would they support
Too early.
Too early.
We don't know the size of the gap yet.
Okay. Yeah. And then just picking up on the NHS contract, I mean, to me it does seem bizarre that, most of these people are full-time working in the NHS. Why would we think that there would be a decent amount of pathology service out there for us if the people that do this job are primarily employed full-time somebody else? Where's the resistance from the Department, would you say, of Health? Is there resistance from the Department of Health of saying that they should be, they think they're busy enough in the NHS? Would that be their position, perhaps?
I don't necessarily say that there's resistance. I think they're obviously very keen to understand the kind of implications of that. Obviously, this would have additional resource implications on sort of already overburdened practitioners, and I think we just need to be mindful of that and conscious of the implications, and obviously that's stuff that we are continuing to engage with them on.
Okay. So when do you think we might hear positive progress on both the fee and working arrangements?
As I say, we're currently reviewing all of the responses to the call for evidence, of which there was a significant number of those. I would like to think that we would be in a position to be able to kind of make progress on that in the next couple of months with advice to Minister Freer very shortly.
Okay. And then
it's on the agenda every meeting.
Okay. Next section really to ask you about, we've discussed again a little bit about a national coroner service versus the local service, and I think you're right to say, Minister Freer, that a national service doesn't guarantee uniformity of standards just because it's national. But one of the areas where I felt there was more common ground, again relating back to our 2021 report, was on a national inspector. That you could still have judicial independence and variation in approach, but you might have a national inspector that might pick out some of these issues that my colleague highlighted in terms of instances where the service potentially is not where it should be. I think previously the government had said that they were giving consideration to our views that there should be a national inspector. Have you considered it? And if not, when might you finish or even begin your considerations?
I think that our position has probably shifted away from a no to it's something that we would now actively consider. The issue will be how it is done. I'm always rather reliant. We tend to rush to we have an inspector for this or a commissioner for that, and we just add layers of complexity. I think one thing we do need to understand, so I think there's a strong argument for inspection. However, I do also want to understand how it would mesh with the other levels of inspections that are going on across, if you like, the health and death. I hate the word, so I sort of buzzwords, landscape. But we've got the NHS have got different levels of inspections as well. So I do think it's worth looking at, and it's one that I'm keen to look at, but I also want to ensure how it would mesh with other inspectorates. What I don't want is just have another inspector going around with another inspector and overlap. I think it needs to be a bit more coordinated to make sure we don't duplicate and it is effective. So our position has shifted, but I want to make sure that it is done properly rather than make sure we just rush to inspect.
I guess if the remit was sufficiently narrow to the operationalisation of the coroner's process, what would be the overlap? What inspector would overlap with that?
Well, certainly I think we need to see how it would interact with the medical examiners, because the new medical examiner role is going to be quite crucial, almost like a gateway to the coroner, to the post-mortem. So I would want to understand how that is operating. But you've also got other inspectors, and I'm talking kind of just. No, I won't in case I get it completely wrong. So I'd rather say nothing than get it wrong. But the medical examiner is a good example of how you've got a new regime which acts as a gateway into, in some elements, a gateway into the coronial service, and we need to see how that would interact with inspection.
And when, again, consider it was a 2021 recommendation, and I think we previously had a promise that it was going to be given consideration. When do you think you might have actually finished your considering?
The starting point will be once we see the medical examiner position rolled out on a statutory basis, so we can see how that lands and also see how the new MCCD process lands. Once they are bedded in, then we'll know how that inspection regime or that regime is working, and so that's not. I wouldn't say it's going to be done by summer recess, because I don't think we'll see the medical examiner on a statutory basis until later this year. So it's, as Minister always say, soon, but not in terms of, I can't give you a hard deadline.
All right.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to ask you about the experience of bereaved families as part of the Coroner Service. So just before I do that, just to pick up on Dr. Mullen's question about the inspectorate, and really just to try and be helpful, if that can possibly be achieved, is to pray in aid of the joint inspection of special educational needs and disability services, where we looked at setting up an inspection regime which involved both the CQC and Ofsted working in tandem, developing a new framework. So it may be worth just looking at the experience that they had and trying to pull together, rather than trying to create something from scratch, what may be already available to provide the level of inspection that is necessary for the Coroner Service. So just throw that out there in
I'll if I can, I'll grab you in the lobby, as they say. And can,
absolutely. Going on to the experience of bereaved people in the Coroner Service, and we had a roundtable as part of this inquiry, spoke to a number of bereaved families about their individual experiences, and there's some themes that came out of that. One or two I'd like to pick up with you, if I may. The first is about the sort of level of information that they're given and guidance about the service and what they can expect. And as part of your written evidence to the committee, there's been an explanation around what's called the Guide to Coroner Services for Bereaved People. I've seen it myself. I was given a copy of it when I was in Warrington. I think it's about 50 odd pages long, so it's quite a lot for someone to get through. But you've said that you're going to be publishing an update of that guide early this year. First question is, when can we expect to see that updated guide?
So I think, unless Ms Davis has a specific date, we are obviously waiting to see how the new legislation on the IPA, because that will have an important role in terms of working with the bereaved. So we need to make sure that it reflects the role of the IPA. But in terms of if we got a specific date, I'm not sure whether Mr Davis has one.
I mean, I think what we would be looking at is in the next couple of months to have that draft ready, and as Minister Freer says, what we are planning to do is do a sort of more fundamental review off the back of the introduction of the IPA and the medical examiner scheme. And I think also as part of that, we're keen to learn lessons from Birkbeck research, and obviously that will be publishing its findings imminently. Obviously they submitted evidence to this committee. And some of the things that we, just to touch on the point that you made about the length of the document, what we might be considering as part of this is kind of like small, more sort of targeted pieces of guidance rather than one. That might be something that we consider, so that it's slightly more accessible and easier to read for depending on the circumstances of the bereaved. That could be something that we look at.
So if I may, Mr. one thing why I'm quite keen to get this right is I met some of the families from the Manchester Arena bombing. It was a deeply distressing experience. Not least because as a government we couldn't deliver what they wanted. But hearing their experiences of how the coronal system was done to them was very striking, and that they felt completely powerless. And also just the attitude. It wasn't just, we know the system is formal, we know it's officious, and you kind of excluded from it. But the whole attitude of the service to kind of pushing the families away and treating them as if they were an afterthought. This is all well documented, I'm not speaking out of turn. And just the hearing from the families themselves was incredibly distressing, and that's why we won't get it perfect, because it is a judicial process. But if we can kind of soften the edges and make people understand how it works and give them a voice, then I think we'll have made significant progress. And part of that, as Mr Davis is saying, is that a 50-page document is ridiculous. It should be something simple, which signposts for further details if people want those further details. But trying to hand somebody, a phone book and hoping they will absorb it in a time of grief, I think is wishful thinking.
And have bereaved families been consulted as part of this redraft of the guidance, so that you're taking fully into account the types of ways that they would find this information presented in a meaningful way, in a way that they're able to absorb it and does actually enhance their experience going through the process?
Certainly for the more fundamental rewrite that we're planning for the IPA and the medical examiner, and as I say, looking at whether to what extent they could be targeted, I think one of our plans would be to make sure that, one, we are utilising the research, as I mentioned, the Birkbeck stuff, that we'll be looking at the role of the bereaved and how their experiences, and it's quite possible that we would want to do some engagement with the bereaved to understand their experiences and to get their feedback on areas of the guide that could be improved.
Just finally on this point, as good as the guide can be, unless bereaved families are aware of it, it won't serve any useful purpose to them. And we did hear about a huge sort of range of experiences where many actually didn't even know about it until we told them, let alone after the process had finished. So a real inconsistency around what information is made available to them. Is there anything that you can do or would undertake to do to first of all establish why that is, why in some courts they're given this information and others they aren't, but also different ways that information can be imparted, not necessarily just in a physical guide, but maybe other ways that they would find it easier in the circumstances to understand what was going to happen.
Let me commit I'll take that away and discuss with the Chief Coroner. I think there are two ways. One is how we get the local office holders to engage with bereaved families, but alongside that I'm aware that it's not a national service, it will vary, that there are a variety of charitable organisations and volunteer groups that provide almost like grief support, whether we can engage with those more to ensure that it's available in a variety of sources, not just from the local coroner's office. So let me take that away from and I'll write back to the committee with some practical steps.
Thank you very much. And just on the support that's provided by charities to bereaved families, that you'll be aware, obviously, of the Coroner's Court Support Service, who we've met and spoken to, and I think they've given evidence to this committee. There's about 400 volunteers across 44, I believe, of the 80 coroner areas in England and Wales. And clearly, both the current Chief Coroner and his predecessor were extremely supportive of their role and were keen to see them rolled out everywhere. And in response, you have agreed to look into this further, according to the written evidence to this inquiry. But on the basis that we're told that it costs about £5,000 to set up one of these services in a new coroner area and about £5,000 to run it every year, we're not talking in the vernacular megabucks for what is clearly a very valuable service for many of these bereaved families. We've heard it from them directly. So first of all, is this something that you're actively considering, turning it into a service that's available in all courts? And as part of your comprehensive engagement plan that you've put in your written evidence, can you explain what that's trying to achieve?
Yeah, I mean, so essentially we would absolutely support extending support services across all of them. As you say, CCSS provide it in 44 of the sort of 80 areas. We're hoping to kind of lower that down to 77 and then 75 coroner areas. And so we absolutely want to support that in any way we can to make sure that those support services are available. We've obviously not been able to progress that work as quickly as we would have liked due to a sort of affordability kind of concerns, but I note the points you make that the volumes or the amounts of money sort of suggested for this is not insurmountable in that sense. We also are mindful that obviously it's at the discretion of the local coroner as well in terms of whether they want support services in their area, and at the moment it's funded by local authorities in part, and in part by donations. But we can absolutely we remain committed to trying to ensure that there are support services across all coroner areas. I mean, CCSS also provides a national helpline and website whereby people can provide or reach out for information and advice, both nationally and internationally, if they should wish. But it's something we're very keen to kind of progress.
It would be remiss of me not to point out that in the committee's report of 2021, the recommendation that, quote, the Ministry of Justice should, as a matter of urgency, provide funding for support services for bereaved people at inquests, such as those provided by the Coroner's Court Support Service, so that this support is available in every coroner area. Could we see perhaps a little bit more urgency now that there's a common view that this is a good thing?
Subject to availability of resources.
£200,000 to kickstart it in the other 40 areas. That's a little ask there.
It's not money I have down the back of the sofa in the office, but
the minister's salaries.
Okay, all right, thank you.
One director less.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Dr. Munn.
Just building on the discussion around families and the experience of the Coroner's Court, I wanted to talk in particular about what's been described as the inequality of arms. And of course the proposition put forward is that the coroner's process is an inquisitorial process that's non-adversarial. If it's purely inquisitorial and neutral finding of the facts, why do public bodies take lawyers to these hearings and use them to prepare their participation?
So, I mean, taking that last point first, I understand that the Chief Coroner has made it very clear that he expects through his coroners that he would expect if this is not if you like, an adversarial process, and the level of representation needs to be significantly scaled back. He's made that very plain. In terms of trying to, if you like, level the playing field, providing legal aid, I think broadly, just as a general, would be the wrong step given the role of the coroner. But what we are doing is, obviously, we've reduced the means test on the exceptional case funding mechanism, which does make it more available to more people. But particularly we are looking at what level of legal aid should be provided to support the independent public advocate process when a major instance is set up. So we're looking at extending access to legal aid without making it simply fueling, if you like, the arms race of representation in the Coroner's Court.
Yeah. I mean, I welcome, as you mentioned, the Chief Coroner's view on this, but he doesn't have any power to make that happen, and individual coroners, as far as I'm aware, might be able to control who turns up on the day, but they can't stop a public body spending huge amounts of public money in preparation. So again, it goes back to that thing, do you think that in itself betrays the fact that in many circumstances it is by default becoming an adversarial process where public bodies are seeking to, and private companies, protect their reputations? Can it really be considered a purely neutral process?
The Chief Coroner does have a lot of influence, but judicial independence that's the price we pay for judicial independence, is that each coroner runs their court as they see fit. But of course I do believe the Chief Coroner does have significance alongside the local coroner to push back on representation in the court. I think it's something we have to keep an eye on, but what I don't want to do is just say, well, because they're doing it, we must give other people, and then all we end up with is an arms race. And I just think that we should try and push back and see if we can ensure that it goes back as much as we can. And I do think the work we've done on the exceptional case funding mechanism and through the IPA will address some of the biggest causes of imbalance.
And I recognise that you're kind of understanding the problem and giving words to kind of comfort, but do you think, I would say overwhelmingly, that NHS Trust, for example, overwhelmingly are very well represented by legal teams, private companies are, so it's not as if these are just occasional things that go on, like the bog standard inquest at which a public body or a private company is represented, there will be an inequality of arms. It's just the default setting rather than the exception that we've got to push back on. Would you accept that?
Well, I think I don't want to accept it, and I do think we need to look at how we can push public bodies to, if you like, to wind their neck in a bit on this. But I just think, opening up legal aid just fuels the arms race, and that's not something I'm keen to do. So I accept the facts on the ground, but it doesn't mean that we have to accept defeat.
Does the MOJ have engagement with, for example, Department of Health on this issue? Do you have discussions with the civil servants that look after litigation and public expenditure on these types of things?
I haven't directly, I'm not sure.
I think, I mean, off the back of the government's response to Bishop James Jones's report into Hillsborough, there was discussion about kind of, the use of legal representation, and obviously, there are kind of contractual requirements around if someone has to attend an inquest or an inquiry, then, they should be having legal representation. I think, what we need to make sure is that that's proportionate. I mean, the other thing I just wanted to flag was that there has been training involved the Chief Coroner and the Bar Standards Board and the SRA about lawyers that attend inquests and how they should behave, and the types of questionings, to try and encourage that more sort of inquisitorial rather than adversarial nature. So there is that movement as well in terms of, expectations about lawyers and how they should behave and how they question witnesses and so on and so forth, because it's not, a criminal trial. It is an inquisitorial process. It's a fact-finding process, and therefore, the lawyers that are participating in that should approach it with that ethos.
But it's not just the lawyers. The lawyers are kind of acting on instruction, really, because as I said, inherently, do you think any public body entering into an inquest process doesn't seek to protect its reputation? Wouldn't that just be the ordinary thing for a public body or a private company to do if they're involved in an inquest? So why do you think it's going to work if they're what we would all assume is common sense goes against what we say it's supposed to be?
I think, obviously, one of the things, and obviously the government signing the Hillsborough Charter, amongst other things, about, and obviously, all of the rules around the Civil Service Code, the Nolan Principles, people should be approaching these with an open and transparent, it shouldn't be about protecting your own interests. That's a culture that we're trying to create across government, and I think that's only right.
Okay.
Maybe have a health minister at your next meeting to...
Okay. Mr. Simpson again.
Oh, thank you, Chair. Can I ask you about what happens after there has been an inquest, and what routes there are for family members to challenge the decision? And you'll be aware that there's no, as things stand, there's no right of appeal to an inquest. There was the Coroner Justice Act 2009, which originally enacted or contained a right of appeal, but it was never brought in and was eventually repealed. So the routes are essentially to the High Court under Section 13 of the Coroners Act 1988, or by judicial review. And when the committee last looked at this, one of the recommendations in 2021 was to revisit this and look at any new mechanisms to appeal or challenge the decision of coroners, which is less unwieldy and complex and potentially expensive. In your written evidence to this inquiry, you explain that work hasn't yet happened, so 3 years on, that work hasn't been done. So could you explain why and what your plans are to do so?
In terms of, obviously, as you've outlined, the current process is there. It can work, but is not the slickest of processes. It's simply that the team is stretched in terms of the other work it is undertaking. So it's purely the fact that the team is small. There's about 5 FTEs that do this kind of work, and it has been stretched on doing other pieces of work. So it's a bad question of other work programmes that have taken a priority. Okay.
But it is still your intention as a department to carry out that work when you're able to, and hopefully off the back of this.
Certainly, as you know, the team have been heavily involved in the preparation on the Independent Public Advocate, which has been quite comprehensive. It's been dealing with Bishop James's report, also been advising things like on online safety harms and the requirement for data storage. So there's been quite a lot of hefty work that the team have been involved in. So it's not that we've sought to kind of just not do it. It's still on the work stream. It's just quite has some chunky pieces of work in the queue in front of it. So we're still committed to doing it.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Hopp.
Thanks. When we met with many bereaved families, and others have been in touch, they've told us about their frustration about when coroners' prevention of future death reports just seem to disappear into a black hole and don't see what happens. So do you think the prevention of future deaths process is working as well as it could?
I can only speak, certainly from the point of view of the MOJ. I actually did a check to make sure that before I came here, I thought, well, I better make sure that the MOJ has got its house in order, and actually we have. And I do think that, broadly speaking, they are useful. I think the system is broadly working well. I think perhaps my personal view is that they add to the narrative. I'm not sure that is there an expectation that you then end up with a body that enforces them or inspects them. And again, I'm a bit wary of constantly creating more and more bodies. I think that the PFDs can inform decision making, but broadly speaking, I think it's working. I'm not saying it's perfect, but I think broadly speaking, it's working.
Push a little bit on that. You say they're working well in that they're created, but in many instances there needs to be action to prevent a future death from occurring. Are you saying that's working well in all or most instances?
I don't know whether there's an official view, but
how is that monitored, for example?
I think there's absolutely more that can be done to ensure that lessons are learnt both at a local and national level. I think that's true, and we're committed to kind of doing that. We expect respondents to take them seriously and to respond, and we will absolutely kind of continue to sort of commit to sort of undertaking more work to see what we can do to improve that and make sure that that's happening. One thing could be, further guidance to coroners around, can we better utilise the existing scrutiny regulatory bodies that already exist across the country to make sure that, where reports are written, that they are targeted to the right national regulators and scrutiny bodies so that there is that sort of national oversight and learning. So I think, there's absolutely stuff there that can be done to improve the process.
And I thank you for that, because the biggest thing that we heard from the family members we spoke to is they just didn't want it to happen to somebody else's family, what had happened to their loved one. And so in that respect, it's all well and good saying, ensure lessons are learned, but we need to see how those lessons are learned and potential future deaths are prevented. The Chief Coroner told us there was a gap in what happens if somebody does not respond to a PFD or puts in an inadequate response. So an element of, where do you think this responsibility for oversight and enforcement of PFDs should sit? With the MOJ? Or are you saying it's purely dispersed with those other bodies you mentioned?
Well, I think those other bodies absolutely have a role. I think, we can absolutely have conversations with those bodies that receive a large volume of PFDs or a larger volume of PFDs, and making sure that they are treating them seriously and responding within the 56 days window. As I say, I think there is absolutely more we can do to make sure that coroners have the guidance on how best to target those responses, and the national bodies are properly scrutinising them and learning lessons to avoid future deaths wherever possible. I think obviously part of the conversations that we've been having with the Chief Coroner is to make sure that, as part of increasing awareness and learning lessons from these, is about making them more easily accessible. And they are being made more available on the Chief Coroner's Office's website, so that academics and researchers and others can access those reports and can do analysis and understand trends.
And that sort of national picture you're then saying about trends and analysis, do you see maybe some merit in Inquest's proposal for a national oversight mechanism, given what you've just said there?
I personally don't. I'm not going to keep making promises that there will be another national body, another national inspector, another national framework.
I think we've said national oversight mechanism.
But what does that mean? Does that mean?
Well, a potential responsibility for someone actually pulling together these themes, because if I may come back on the point you said about improving the reports that are submitted by PFDs by coroners, and if there are recommendations, who oversees that those recommendations are then carried out to then prevent the future death? Otherwise it's just a paper exercise, isn't it?
It's not the coroner's role to implement the recommendations.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Who is ensuring that?
Then the organisations that need to learn from them. But I'm not going to commit the MOJ to...
It's just sort of a Pontius Pilate approach, isn't it?
Well,
it's not my problem, I wash my hands.
No, it's not. Well, I guess if you're being blunt, then yes, but it's equally a matter of resources in terms of I have priorities, and I appreciate it's an important issue, but in terms of the limited amount of resources I have to address the issues facing my portfolio, I have to prioritise, and the PFDs are published. The learning is there to be used. They are published on the Chief Coroner's website. That people can learn from them. The organisation can learn from them. The bottom line is I don't have the resources to create another mechanism to force bodies to learn from them. The bottom line is the system is there, the learning is published, it's transparent, it's open, people need to get on and do that. I can't find the resources to create another national oversight body to force people to act on them.
Isn't the increase in bodies going to be the bodies of the people that die in consequence of these not being acted on?
I think that's unfair. The learning is there to be had. The learning is there to be read and to be learnt from. But equally, I do think that we are, as ministers and as politicians, it is too easy just to say yes, and too easy to say, oh yes, let me look at it. I do think sometimes a bit of candour is needed. And I do recognise there's strong views on this, but equally, within the priorities of my budgets, what is there and out in the public domain is there to be learned from. I do not have the resources to create another oversight mechanism. And I appreciate that people will disagree with me, but I sometimes do think it's important to be honest.
Okay, just following up on that, I'm actually, committee have a diversity of opinion. I'm hugely sympathetic to everything that you've just said in terms of, creating another body and all the rest of it. I guess I'm just slightly surprised to hear that, as the obvious answer to me is, as you mentioned, the other regulators whose job it is. So CQC is the obvious one in healthcare, health and safety executive when it comes to building sites and other issues. I guess I'm surprised to hear that that's to be done. We could do that. To me, that's the obvious thing. How is that not already a job of the MOJ to ensure that these regulators are either directly or through the relevant government department looking at these issues? It's their job, it's what they're paid to do.
I think it is happening, and I think the challenge here is just making sure it's consistently happening. Do coroners at a local level need further advice on who the regulatory bodies are in terms of who they then seek a response from, and just ensure greater consistency, not just at a local level but a national level, and just making sure that that's happening more consistently. I think it does happen, but that was the point I was kind of making.
And I think probably the message I would take from the meeting with the families and how strongly they feel about it, and the legitimate concern that they're raising, is just that you need to be incredibly muscular on that issue, and it isn't necessary for the coroners even. It's the job of the CQC and the Health and Safety Executive to find these things, to act on these things, and it might be at ministerial level. Those government departments need to make sure that they're following these things up, because then actually that whole answer is given, because it is someone's job to do it. I don't know if there are parts of the system that don't have a regulator, but certainly our experience overwhelmingly was healthcare, and there is someone whose job that is to follow those sorts of things up.
I'm more than happy to raise it with the relevant ministers for those bodies, but I do think it's in.
It doesn't cost you a penny.
But my whole approach to select committees and my portfolio is to be helpful where I think I can be helpful. But I don't want to suddenly, I'm not standing next election, so it's much easier for me to say, oh yes, I'll look at that, and in the fullness of time we'll report back, and then it's somebody else's problem. I do think sometimes I will be helpful where I think I can deliver, but equally I want to be honest and say, I appreciate the point, but I don't think I can deliver it for you.
I think that latter suggestion is perhaps the sweet spot of stuff that you can actually deliver and would make a difference and doesn't cost anything.
Just by way of example, I mean, for the ones that have come through to the HMPPS on the prison side, we've as Minister Freer alluded to, we've responded to all of those. We take them seriously, and that's our expectation of others that are recipients of them. And as a result of those, significant changes have been made at local prisons. Whether it's prioritising training to staff on suicide and self-harm prevention, those are happening at a local level. Lessons aren't being learnt, and those are being adopted, and that will make a difference.
Yes, Mr. Timpson.
Thank you, Chair. Can I look at this from another perspective and ways that we can maybe try and enhance the ability for those on the ground to ensure that the same mistakes in practice aren't made again in the future, and that's around data and understanding what actually is happening in cases where there may be preventable death. And As a comparator, over in Australia and New Zealand, you may be aware that they have a data repository which contains information on deaths reported to a coroner in both countries, which is an essential data tool for many coroners and researchers to obtain nationally standardised information about the causes of preventable death. I think they do injury as well. All sorts of information, demographic information about the deceased, contextual details on the circumstances of the death, searchable reports, including the coronial finding, autopsy, toxicology reports, police notification of death reports, and so on. Do you think that if creating another body isn't the answer, to try and provide some sort of way of getting consistency and good learning across the system, that there's more that could be done, potentially reflecting what's being done down in Australia and New Zealand, to give those working in the coronial system the information, the data that they can then interrogate and use to improve their own practice?
There's no reason why not, and in fact I have scheduled a visit to Australia in May, and I intend to go and visit it and have a look at it for myself whilst I'm there. Yeah, it's a perfectly legitimate, if the system is replicable, then I don't see why we shouldn't look at it. And I did commit. I can't remember the academic I met from Oxford.
Yeah, Georgina Richards.
And I said, when she mentioned it, I did say, as luck would have it, I'm off to, hopefully, going to visit Sydney, and I said I'd go and have a look at it and see if there's any learning that I can bring back.
Okay, good, because one of the potential advantages, they've done a lot of the donkey work, so when it comes to potential implementation in the UK, perhaps there's a good cost-effective route to delivery.
It'll be far too easy.
Yeah. We live in hope.
Yeah. Mr. Riley.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to come back to the medical examiners, because they'll be going live in less than 2 weeks' time. And the medical certificate cause of death, MCCD, is going to be altered to update it for certain things. But there's a delay in that going live online. Can that be brought forward? Because often it is the writing that's on the certificate that causes the delay in the release of the body. Mm-hmm. So if that can be done. And secondly, in relation to the medical examiners, because every death has to go to them, will that not now cause a delay for faith-related deaths and the release of the bodies? Because if it is a 9-to-5 job and a death happens on the weekend, there will be no medical examiner to certify the release of that body till, say, Monday, Tuesday, and inevitably in certain areas there's going to be a backlog. Mm-hmm. So rather than help the process, that will actually prevent from bodies from being released. What is being done to provide adequate resources to make sure there's no delay?
A couple of broad answers to that. I mean, certainly the implementation of the new MCCD will rely on a rewrite of the IT system that underpins it. And that will take a minimum of 12 weeks, and we are not at that stage. So there, as you mentioned, there is a delay to the implementation. There is also, if I can, through you, Chair, when I was out at the Gardens of Peace yesterday, there's some debate as to whether the MCCD should actually record the religion rather than just the ethnicity. And that's worth working through, because it does give more data on disparities of cause of death. In terms of the genuine, I think it's a very genuine concern about whether this is a 9-to-5 job. It doesn't have to be, of course. And certainly the implementation, if you like, the programme board is now being chaired by Minister Caulfield and I, to make sure that there is some additional, shall we say, impetus to getting this over the line. And I will commit to taking that away, to making sure that we make the service as flexible the times of operating as possible, ensure that the faith communities are not disadvantaged. So I can't give you an exact answer today, but I will give you the commitment that I will add it to the work stream. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. Look, you've been very frank with us, and I appreciate you want to get things right and that resources are finite. But equally, I think you were a bit surprised at some of the comments from the Chief Coroner. Is there a need perhaps to look at this with a bit more urgency, perhaps, given the way things have moved on since 2021? Yes.
Certainly, given the
case for that, perhaps.
Yeah. Certainly, given the comments that you've conveyed from the Chief Coroner, I will make a bitter pat to his daughter, have that full and frank conversation that he's clearly had with you.
Very grateful.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Minister. Mr Davis, thanks for your time and your evidence today. Session's concluded. Order, order.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.